The family is the foundation of society, a truth that any sensible society should put at the heart of policy making. But does it? To discuss this, I'm joined by Ed Davies, who is Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice and an expert of sorts on family policy. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you. Nicely qualified with of sorts. Yeah.
Well, I suppose, you've published a lot on it. You talk a lot about it. So, now, there's a lot to talk about here, and I thought the first thing we should do is sort of paint a picture, really, of what family life is like today in the UK. Not what it was, but what's it like now? If you were going to do a snapshot, married family, single parent, cohabitation. So how would you...
It's not good, in short. It's historically bad, and it's internationally comparatively bad. So to give you a few statistics that give you a flavour of it, I mean, sort of a big headline one would be 50 years ago, a 16-year-old sitting their O-levels as they were then, had a 90% chance of living with their mum and dad. Today, for a child sitting their GCSEs this summer, it will be about 50-50.
It's astonishing.
It's incredible how quickly that's happened as well. I mean, in a really no time. So that's the sort of the headline of feel of what's going on. But then there are all sorts of markers along the way as well. We've recently tipped over into the majority of adults not being married, recently tipped over to the majority of children not being born to married families. The sort of the marriage rate.
Is that right? So now the majority of children born in the UK are not to...
So yeah, in 2022, it was the first year ever that saw more children born outside marriage than within marriage. It's interesting, there's probably a slight COVID effect there, so we may go back over that threshold again, but it was that first moment we hit that tipping point,
So that's it, and you mentioned obviously people are always inclined to compare this country with that country, this region with that region, and you're right, we don't compare well with some other European societies, do we?
Very much so. I mean, it's interesting that this sort of, over the years, this has felt like the preserve of social conservatives and right-wings and things like that. But interestingly, probably the best study on this recently has been from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who've done a huge equalities review, and they found that looking across family life in Europe, UK has the most fragile and complex family structures now in the whole of Europe. And actually, worldwide, the only developed nation in a worse state is the US. Who have a high proportion of lone parents.
Is it worse in the Anglosphere generally?
It's pretty bad. I mean, basically the developed world, it's interesting that the rate of lone parenthood, I think it's the OECD that maybe recorded this, across the world, the rate of lone parenthood is about 6%. When you look at the developed world, we're about 21%, America at 23%, Europe sort of in the teens. So generally it's the developed world and the Anglosphere are in a much worse place than the rest of the world,
Well, before we get on to some of the consequences and outcomes of this, let's just dig a little deeper. So there are... within the proportion of people that are in married relationships or cohabiting or single parenthood, there are class gaps, aren't there? Social class gaps. So I read a book by an economist, American economist called Kearney. I think it was called Two-Parent Privilege.
Yes, Two-Parent Privilege.
Yeah, and it was a little bit long, but it was basically the point. And I think it's the same here, isn't it? That two parents bringing up their own kids is becoming a thing of the affluent.
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. We don't record this data very well in the UK. So actually that opening statistic...
Why don't we?
...was drawn out. Well, I sometimes worry we're going to be a bit afraid of what we find if we really dig into this. But we did a piece of work a couple of years ago now looking at the Family Resources Survey, which is a sort of technical survey carried out intermittently to ask families the state of their life. And it's not big enough to cut down by huge numbers, but under white families, we were able to say that if you're in the top 20% income-wise, you had an 85% chance of having married parents, and I think it was another 12% were cohabiting. If you're in the bottom 20%, bottom fifth, it was 19% had married parents. So that gap between them is absolutely vast, and a fairly linear sort of trajectory in between as well.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes charts and graphs paint a thousand words, don't they? In Kearney's book, actually, you have the snapshots. You have basically 1940s, 1950s, where there wasn't that much difference in marriage, stability across the classes. It was all there. And then what happens is that the affluent, the well-paid, stay reasonably high. And then there's just a collapse, isn't there? Just a fall-off, massive fall-off.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about some of the causes possibly of that a bit later, but that's had a huge impact, isn't it, on the poor?
Yeah, I mean, enormously. And it's one of those situations now where it's complex in the interaction. Like, that some low income does lead to family breakdown leads to low income. But what you are seeing is a very high proportion now of lone parent families who are at food banks or on welfare or things like that. So about half of lone parent families now rely on welfare.
And that's, it's very difficult because you're trying to get a causal root to this, and you've got both cause and symptom. Yeah, it's interlinked. So it's difficult to entangle, isn't it?
It's, quite interesting on this. You'll never get perfect evidence. Like, I can't do a randomized controlled trial. I can't,
No, we can't
force people to marry, force people to separate, send a control group to the moon. And I think people use that as an excuse, though. I think there are things we definitely can say. So, for example, we know the correlations with mental health are terrible. And when we actually speak to, there's a study with 4,500 children that asked them, why are you going to child and adolescent mental health service? And by far the leading answer was family relationships. And so they're never going to be a perfect randomized controlled trial, but you can sort of confirm through various things, there is the cause happening there.
But so among groups, obviously there's a social class element there. It should be obvious to anyone, if you're under more financial stress, more stress on a marriage, more stress on relationships, there might be consequence there.
Yeah.
So, and just relationships being under strain and falling apart. I can see that. But interestingly, in the UK, as far as I can tell, perhaps you could tell me, there are quite big differences in different cultural groups.
Yes.
So, for instance, marriage stability. I interviewed Rakib Hassan recently, or a couple of years ago anyway, and he was making the point that actually marriage stability, say in the British Bangladeshi community, is pretty high.
Yeah.
British Hindus, massively high. Other East Asians, very, very high. Whites, not as high, and the black community has a crisis on its hands, doesn't it, in absent fatherhood? Yeah, what are the stats?
Exactly that. So that's really interesting, and you see a huge variation. It's interesting you mentioned last there on black families as well. Actually, the difference between the black Caribbean community and the black Africa community is huge. And so when you break it down by culture, you see really different rates. And we've done some work around education in the past on this, and what you find is that educational attainment in children almost completely correlates with the ethnicity's marriage rate as well.
Right.
So that goes all the way through. So you tend to find Chinese do very well, then Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani. At the bottom, you have white working class, you have black Caribbean, and so on. So there is this huge sort of range, and the correlation with outcomes is absolutely huge. Just on that question there of the variation between rich and poor as well. Interestingly, if you are married and in the bottom quintile, bottom 20%, you are more likely to stay together than if you are cohabiting and in the top quintile. So there's definitely financial pressure affects marriage. Definitely. It'll affect any relationship. But there's also a reality that committing to a relationship, regardless of money, makes it more stable.
Well, let's go on to that. So the snapshot. Let's look at outcomes. So I'm going to ask you a basic question because it's an important one. It's a question which many people, certainly many politicians, are disinclined to want to answer. You're not a politician. You're
Let's see. Yeah.
an expert. But are two-parent families beneficial to children and society?
Of course. And I think the reason we don't like to talk about it is because it is personal and it's sensitive. And if there's you and me here, chances are one of us, this is our personal experience. So I get that it's hard to talk about. But the evidence at a population level particularly is absolutely clear on this, that actually being raised by your mum and dad gives you the best start in life. And I think I really understand why people are reticent. And in some ways, particularly for politicians, you're trying to go out and vote, you don't want to alienate people. People are scared of stigmatizing them. But I think we're in this position now where it is so widespread and normalized to put children in this position that we have to start looking at this through a child-centric lens.
I totally agree with you, but I was actually stopped in Hexham Marketplace during the election last summer by a lady who said, I couldn't vote for you. I said, why is that? She said, because you're sort of ultra right wing. I said, well, why do you think that? I mean, we're really not. And she said, yeah, you stick up for the family. I said, on what are you thinking of? Why on earth are you saying that?
Yeah.
It was one of these moments. But I criticize politicians for not standing up for the family and also being honest about the data. So yeah, I mean, on the data, in every society virtually, two-parent, and certainly marriage, there is a difference between cohabitation and marriage,
Yeah.
as you say, on the outcomes. But the outcomes that we're talking about is educational achievement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Crime.
Yep. I mean, pretty much any outcome you can think of.
Yeah.
I mean, really, in terms of social policy, you are looking at an advantage to being raised by your mum and dad in a committed relationship. And so, in mental health, I think if you are living with married parents at primary school, you have a 6% chance. You still have a chance for a diagnosable mental health condition. Among cohabiting, it rises to 12%, and among lone parents and separated parents, it's about 18%. So you see a doubling and then tripling.
I saw that, yeah, isn't it? It's a straight line.
Yeah,
yes, isn't it?
I mean, it's really interesting.
Astonishing.
And similarly in education, you are just twice as likely to drop out of school if you are from a cohabiting or lone parent family. And those quite basic statistics they're quite painful. You know, I've got lots of friends who have separated and what have you, and acknowledging that for your own children is hard, but we've got to be honest about that.
Yeah, and it's not to be critical or judgmental of others necessarily, just stating the facts at this point. But on something like that is very difficult. It's also very, very interesting in social policy, because trying to get causal paths to your 18%. So let's just dig down on this. It's very interesting. So 6%. This is mental disorder.
Yeah.
6% married kids. Both parents are married. 12% for cohabitees kids, and 18% for single parents.
Yeah.
Now, the difficulty that you'll have is, say, you can't just click your finger and want everyone to be, shift that category into the other category, because that itself is causal.
Yeah.
Because, the turbulence of people's lives or personality types, whole series of things that have led to people being in that situation are also actually in the kids as well.
Yeah, completely. And I think some of this as well, it comes down to, historically, I think when we've talked about family, we've talked about family breakdown. And actually the reality is I cannot speak into anyone's family about whether they should or should. Some families need to break down. Some families, there is abuse and what have you.
Yes.
I think the real concern for me is that we have stopped valuing the act of commitment, the marriage in the first place, the civil partnership. And that actually that 6%, the children of married people, who do very well, we're not aiming for that anymore. As a society, we are saying the majority of children, we don't mind if they're born outside of that scenario, where actually, by definition, they will start at 12% or maybe get to the 18%. And coming back to that point of we need to value marriage and commitment in the first place would make an enormous difference.
Yeah, no, because I want to run through, we're still sort of on consequences or outcomes, but, causes, it's a huge question, actually. I think it's not clear at all. Certainly Kearney's book that I've just read, she's got data and studies. There was a theory, for instance, that, white working class men with better jobs would marry at a greater rate. Yeah. The studies she did in the book, they don't. Yeah. Because there's been sort of massive shift in attitudes and is what people want to do. So a lot of the assumptions, because I talk about housing a lot, I'm very, very keen on it. I think it's our biggest domestic macroeconomic problem. And the SDP has some great ideas about how we can solve it if we're really keen on solving it. The state has to get back in the business of building houses. And I always make the case that, how do you expect people to get married and have kids if there's not a route for them into the house to do so?
Yep.
Which is all well and good, but then you've got some states that are, Orban's Hungary is piling money in to try and incentivize people, and they get some tick up, but it's not massive, is it?
Yeah. And some of this is really long-term, deep cultural roots. I mean, I would trace this back probably to the Second World War. But I think at that point, you had a number of huge changes. So during the Second World War, you had a number of women working who wouldn't have worked before, and brilliantly, they found they liked it, and they could have economic independence. And then you had laws passed in the decades since then for female employment. And I think parts of that, among other things, of sexual independence, the pill, I think a reaction to the Second World War, that sort of communitarian feel went to individualism, but all that built together to sort of say, actually, we're going to really value the individual now. And some of the downsides of marriage, and there definitely have historically been downsides, we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. So actually, you can have a perfectly good committed relationship where both partners work or don't work, or you juggle that between you. But somehow it became actually, because now I can work and earn money, I'm independent and I don't need that. And actually, we still do need that relationship.
Well, yeah, but what we don't, it's very difficult in the culture, and we may as well dive straight into that. I mean, the particularly young women will say, look, I want to be a strong, independent woman. That's the sort of thing. And actually, it's very difficult to say, well, was that an aim? Did you want to be totally independent, or are you happy, or do you actually want to find someone that you spend your life with that you are dependent on?
Yeah.
It's almost the opposite. It's a level of individualism which is so embedded now within societies and people's expectations. David Goodhart talks a lot about achieved identities and so on, but really, it's a completely different world to one where you would not put yourself first. Maybe you'd have duty to other people and maybe sacrifice a few things. But we're not, the individualism because I love to blame, virtually all of our problems on double or triple liberalism, economic and social liberalism. And I think there's a lot in that case, but it's a difference. There's a difference between acknowledging it and understanding it and actually having a way out of it, isn't there? Well, how do you get out of the individualism that we've had?
I mean, I do think so. I remember years ago we did polling of children coming out to end of school and saying, would you value marriage, family? And they all say yes. It is what they want. And yet it's happening later and later or not at all now. And so at some point we are butting up against people who actually want this, but they're not doing it. And so let's ask why. And I think there are quite a few reasons for why.
But that's when I always come in, because in the why aren't they?
Yeah.
If we're talking about economic causes for this, I would always come and say, well, the cost of housing, the cost of energy, the pressure that you're under. This is why we can't afford to, in inverted commas.
So
do you think there's much?
I don't really buy that. It's interesting. I hear a lot of that, and I do think there are some individually good studies that look at the cost of housing on birth rate. Actually, so I have seen some really good sort of.
And it will be plus B, won't it? I mean, it's got to have an effect.
Yeah, it's going to have an effect. It's how big that effect is, and actually, in the sort of big sense, that effect is not always that huge. What you tend to find is the thing that has a really big effect on birth rates, for example, is not a house, it's the marriage. It's like actually what people want is a person that they can have children. And if that doesn't happen, then the rest doesn't happen either.
Yeah.
And we are sort of selling this vision of the world that says actually the main thing is GDP, it's as much as you can earn, it's your career and all the rest of it. When actually all the evidence on happiness says actually your marital status is really important as well. And we've completely traded one for the other. And that's not just women, that's men and women.
Oh no, all of us. No, I don't think there's any... I mean, I do. It's funny when I was thinking about this interview, because I try and be as forthright as I can on it, and particularly on evidence on any topic at all, whether it's crime or social policy. I just tend to try and say it as it is. I think there's a need for honesty. People are fed up with people not being frank. And when you get issues where the man in the pub and the birds in the trees know that something's true, politicians won't be honest about it.
Yeah,
I think it's very, very frustrating. But having said that, we're both men.
Yeah.
Have you found it difficult to sort of, are there limits on some areas that you can talk about in this? Because a lot of it does get down, particularly with marriage and parenthood and motherhood. Like two men talking about motherhood. Because I don't think you'll get this regeneration in family life until you prioritize fatherhood and motherhood.
Yeah.
It's easy for me to say the father of three. I can say that, but do you find it's difficult?
So I think we have to accept that sometimes that marriage has changed over thousands of years, sort of the way it's viewed, and it has and will, and rightly so, evolve into something different. I think the thing that hasn't changed is the centrality of the moment of commitment. That is the thing that, whether it's jumping over a stick in an ancient culture or whether it's passing chattel around, whatever it is, it's the moment of commitment that hasn't changed, and that remains the case. And I think for men and women now, it's a very different, much to the good society, and actually women do work and they're not owned by men, but that doesn't change. That act of commitment is tremendously important, whether you are a man or a woman. And if you want to particularly raise children, which people still just want to, it's a great thing, you will need to think about actually, do we care for each other? Are we committed when the rubber hits the road, which you will do? Like having children is a complete nightmare, and if you have this moment where you have said, we are committed to each other through thick and thin, then when the thin comes, you have that moment where you know someone's got your back.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, one of the things, because we'll talk about policy in a second in more detail, but one of the things that certainly in my own life I think was very useful was, I mean, it's a religious right, okay, and I think yet another causal factor is the decline of religion anyway. I think that's you've got to say that, because marriage is a component of that. But before we got married, you went through the Catholic marriage guidance sessions, and they weren't one. There was a few, and you had to think very carefully about it. And I think that was very useful. But some policymakers, some policy thinkers are saying actually the state could sponsor that, help and actually pay two things: pay for weddings, which has been suggested, and pay for a little not get to know you. You'd hope that but a little. Have you thought about this and have you thought about that?
Yeah.
Sensible?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm of the opinion that, it's the middle of the Six Nations. I'm also a rugby fan. I don't know if you know Sir Clive Woodward. who coached the 2003 winners, in his book, which is basically more a management manual than anything about rugby. He talks about how you change a team and how you change a culture. He talks about, I didn't just come in and change something 100%. I found 100 things which I improved by 1%.
Yeah.
And I think we're in the situation now where it's a big cultural thing. And actually, there's no one thing that's going to change what's happening now. But we need 100 small things, of which marriage preparation lessons, of which perinatal sort of care around that. Are we engaging dads enough in that sort of thing? We could do lots on that. I think the tax system. Can we do something to the tax system? I think there are all sorts of things we can broach on this.
I think it's always worth doing anything that would make things better.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. There's not a single wham bam cause and when you solution. But when you're talking about causes, some of them are so fundamental. You know, the decline in Christianity in the West and in Britain in particular. I don't see it coming back very quickly. I urge people to attend church whether they believe or not, because it's the belonging, not the belief necessarily, and it's good for you to do that. But I think you can't make it come back, and I think it's such an important foundation and cause of everything else. But compared to some of these other things, I mean, one of the other things that people have obviously. People like Miriam Case have written extensively now on the falling birth rate, which is again, marriage is the family is the foundation of society, but there is no society in the future if your TFR drops to 1. I mean, it just collapses. We just explain to people why that's important.
I mean, there is this huge trade-off at the moment. And the thing is, it affects everything we do. So actually, it's been really interesting over the last year, the conversation around immigration. And everyone is convinced we need lower immigration. But our birth rate is 1.4. If our birth rate stays where it is and probably goes down, mass migration is the reality of what we need to keep our economy at the stage it's at. And particularly with an aging population, we can't really survive without it. And so the conversation becomes either we increase the birth rate or we have mass migration or we get rid of the pension age or something.
I'm not sure. I mean, I've argued
balance.
I don't necessarily accept that, because I think there are other societies and other models that you could do. I mean, it's certainly in a lot of political discourse, it seems to be taken for granted that falling birth rate, falling CFR, labour gaps, the shape of the pyramid changes, and then you've got to just import lots of people. The Japanese are running, in a way, we're running 2 live experiments, aren't we?
Yeah.
The Japanese are going to have to cope with fewer active workers as a proportion to their retired, and we. I wish it weren't the case, because I can make a good case for the contrary, but we are just going down the mass importation of people in a million a year, 1 or 2 million gross, and so on, which is another thing. And obviously we could well have on the ONS projections have a national population of 72 million. I think that's a mistake, and I think you could certainly if the government asked, particularly participation of fit older people to do something, which they've never been asked.
Yeah.
I think there are other routes, actually. But anyway, we're going down a blind alley on that. But it's just, no, but I agree. I mean, in a sense, if the TFR, you are dealing with a dying civilization, literally.
Yeah.
And the maths are scary, aren't
It's
they?
terrifying.
When you
if you're in South Korea at the moment, where birth rate's 0.6, I remember recently there was this sort of coup, and people were like, what's going on in South Korea? It's like, well, that is a dying society. And particularly, not many people speak Korean. You've got the North Koreans, but they famously don't get on with the South Koreans and so on. So it is a very difficult position they find.
I sort of say, I speak a little. But yeah, no, it is. It's scary. And actually, South Korea is another very, very interesting case in point as a society that knows, and it's an intelligent, productive society. It knows it's going through this, and it's, on some calculations, Ed, it's spent $500 billion trying to get people to marry and have kids.
Yeah,
It's failed.
Yeah.
But I think, let's just go into the next thing about, I think the reason that it's failed is that in South Korea's case, now to some extent here, one of the causes of the collapse in marriage and fertility is status. Have you heard that?
Yeah, it's made marriage a high status thing.
Yeah. Do you buy that? Do you think there's?
I do to a degree. So I do think marriage actually does have a status now, because we were talking about at the beginning, it's something that rich people do. And so there is a sort of thing about it that does do that.
But remember, can I just jump in? The problem with that is that, it's like drug taking, a lot of other things, particularly socially liberal things. the social liberal doesn't practice what they preach.
Yeah.
They preach, social liberalism, but practice conservatism.
Yeah.
Which is very dishonest. But it's the difference between, stated and revealed prepreference, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
where we live, they preach multiculturalism, but they live in nice villages in Kent, So this is the point. I have less time for what people say than I support.
Well, they do what they do. Yeah. I think it's very true. But I suppose some of that comes back to what we were talking about earlier about this is quite a squeamish area to talk about.
It is.
And so
that's why I'm talking about it.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think I want to open...
Rightly so. But it speaks to people who can see the benefit. And they can see in their own lives, if I do this thing, my children are going to benefit. But I don't want to sound judgmental to my friend. I don't want to sound judgmental to this person over here. And so they won't talk about it.
But that's my point. That's why I've just finished Dry January, by the way. I did an interview. It's hilarious. I did a couple of interviews, and people said, we've never seen the indignant Will. So sort of laid back, And I said, well, it's Dry January. What do you expect? But it's not now. I do get indignant about this because it's what liberal influencers are doing. And it's a bit like, David Goodhart talks about this all the time, about family policy or on welfare particularly, and what the state does with tax and benefits for the married family is dictated by a small number of what he would say anywhere well-educated women who influence this for their needs. They forget about the rest of society because the price and the cost is put on someone else. Some other group.
I think the voice of children is completely lost in this. So when we talk about...
There isn't any voice.
No.
There's no concern. It's barely mentioned.
And particularly around, we talk about things like childcare and family policy. Childcare is actually economic policy. I mean, the way that we are now moving as an entire Western world into more and more childcare at a younger age, without ever asking if it's in the children's interest, sort of speaks to we are this GDP-focused nation. Doesn't really think about human flourishing, particularly child flourishing. And so we are going down this road further and further that undermines the family.
We don't, so let's shift on to policy now, because this is the sort of crux of it, really, if you want to make a difference. On childcare, if we're going to start there, we advocate policies that would make it easier for parents to spend more time with their own kids, particularly in that crucial time from birth to 5 years old. And on the data, men and women want to spend more time with their kids. They don't want to go back to work straight away. Certainly, the vast majority, 80% of women don't want to do that. But a lot of them are forced to do that.
Yeah.
So the big thing, which is probably, I think it's the CSJ's policy, or so much as you have policies. But it's our policy, which is full sharing of tax allowances and benefits, which is the heavy lifting. Could you just go into how that would help?
So what we've looked at, actually, so both the sharing of that, sort of sharing of tax thresholds, benefits, that sort of thing. We've also looked at front loading of child benefit, which could do a huge amount, actually.
Because I read that. So what do you mean by front loading?
So at the moment, you get paid child benefit up to 16 or 19, depending on various things, certain incomes. If you put all that in the early years, into the first 4 years.
Where it matters.
Where it really, really makes a difference. And we've sort of decided, actually, you're going to get winners and losers in this. So we wanted to make it cost neutral. We don't want the government to necessarily just throw money at this.
What about universality?
Actually, in that first 4 years, that's when it makes a difference. So making sure, regardless of universality, regardless of anything else, that it's the same pot of money, just focus there. And what we'd say,
small say effect.
So the amount of money you would see in those early years is significantly higher. So suddenly it becomes a real choice. At the moment, there isn't really a choice. You're subsidised. And so the other thing we do is the vouchers. Well, childcare vouchers become cash. Put them in the early years, so that you have a significant amount of cash there, which is quite high risk as well. People might misspend that, but it basically puts that control in the hands.
That's always the argument, isn't it? Because the drug addict will just buy, or the alcoholic will just buy.
And I think you can't get childcare sort of policy to solve everything. There have to be other things out there too. But the reality is if you have teenage children, you're still receiving money from the state. You could actually be going out to work. Whereas when they are very young and that attachment is very important and it is very hard to work, we could support you more just by taking the money from here and putting it there. And so there would be winners and losers, and so it's hard politically, but I think most people get it.
That's the nature of politics. I'm sorry. If you don't put it there, you can put it there, and so on. These are all choices. Certainly, it's an interesting one. I think we might look at that.
Yeah,
we might to approach that policy because it certainly makes sense. you're direct, when someone's 12 and 13, 14, 15, and they're sending on to university, still getting child benefit. Is that efficient? Is that way? I sort of agree with you on that. But I certainly in explaining it to the public, where in a cafe in Leeds, you can say, well, under our policy, you could earn 26 grand between you, and you would pay any tax on that, and you might, and the public jump at that.
Yeah,
they do. They really do.
Yeah.
They get it, understand it. Other ideas which are sort of floating around. These are probably more granular or smaller. Family hubs.
Yeah, huge fans of family hubs. Yeah, so they were invented by the CSJ, so I've got to back those. But essentially, they're the sort of successor to Sure Start, which people are more familiar with, but it looks at the whole sort of length of child's life. So family hubs don't just focus on 1 or 2 early years. They focus on sort of 0 to 19 and 25, some of them for children with disabilities.
And that was in particular, it was 75 towns, was it?
Yeah, so there are 75 local authorities. Actually, I've just heard that there are, sort of the wonderful nature of grassroots sort of organisations, there are a lot more than that now, just being sort of bubbling up from below. So there are now a lot that aren't necessarily recognised by the government or funded by the government, but local authorities, local councils have seen actually this is a good thing, we'll do that. And a lot of them, because of the way they've grown as well, because they are grassroots, they're more of a network than a building. So Sure Start was a single building where you would take your child. This is a network of services and ideas and groups and things which can entirely reflect the local demographic.
And have you got data back? Because I know claims are always made for these type of policies that it nets off and actually saves you money in the long run. I mean, I think there are a whole host of areas where that's true.
Yeah.
You sort of instinctively know it must be true, but you haven't got the data. Is the data coming out?
So the government is doing a review at the moment, which will come out in 2026, next year, I think. So we just did a brief sort of qualitative interim, have a look at this. And what we have found is they're definitely well targeted. So something about Sure Start was, I mean, they became known as sort of a lot of middle-class mummies going there, and actually they were well targeted. We can definitely say that family hubs are better targeted, the demographics. It's still quite early days for really good quantitative data, but I think that's going to come soon. I think by and large, it feels like it's going to be positive.
And more widely in the tax system, anything else that you'd suggest would do heavy lifting?
I mean, I do think family taxation is the sort of obvious one. It's
two-parent penalty people talk about.
I mean, within the benefit system, I mean, that is there as well. And it is this thing of there are probably 100 different levers we need to pull at once. So it's not thinking, if we do family taxation.
But there is a limit to how much taxation policy and policy on welfare and so on and the rest of it can really shift the dial. I think the state is Georgia. There was a very interesting cultural case, which I read about recently, which is, I think there's in Georgia, the Grand Patriarch, the head of the Orthodox Church there, agreed to baptize any third child, and suddenly there was just a massive uptick of third children. So the birth rate just went up on that moment. And it's one of these things that proves in a way that the culture, in a way, it does heavier lifting than some of these other things. Like do we slightly delude ourselves about how much real change some of these little policies can make? Do you agree?
I do think, I mean, famously, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I totally believe that. Where I think policy can play a role is in shaping culture, which is why I think you have hundreds of policies targeted at this one thing. You can start to shape culture. So, I mean, a really small classic one, I remember when my kids were born years ago now, they're teenagers, you get asked to go along as the non-birthing parent. Let's call the dad a dad. I know where it comes from. I know it's coming from a good place. But when you start as a culture,
some of it isn't there. Some of it isn't. Some of it is. But some of it, you're very generous.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I like to think I'm the best of people that it's from a good place. But I think that good place sort of diminishes fatherhood as a massively important thing. And I think understanding that making a big deal of saying this matters, you turning up matters, is really important.
But that's where the cultural shift has to come, because to sort of try and wrap this up now and pull it together. I think the battle is, I think the detailed policy is important. I think that can make a big difference. But I think if you lose the big cultural heavy lifting, you've got to say, which is true, that outcomes for children in society are better in married traditional families. That is true. And you also got to say that lads need dads and be honest about it and not flinch from it. And then if we could change the status of motherhood and fatherhood, I think we'd be really onto something. How are we going to do this, Ed? How are we going to?
Some of it is almost education. I mean, we have education makes like something you teach at school, but it is realizing that the evidence does say That actually, particularly for men, it's really interesting, the sort of the male side of this as well, that men are opting out of marriage a lot. Like making men realize you will live longer, you will earn more, you will be happier and healthier if you are married. Like understand that this is in your interest. I mean, interestingly, for women as well, it is a good thing, but it is even more of a good thing for men, and actually making sure that is known and understood.
Do you think in the sort of school civics lesson, you could make the point that actually, and actually teenage guys, would really benefit from this, that marriage is a civilizing force.
Yeah.
All the data says that.
Yeah. Certainly, we're doing a project at the moment at CSJ called Lost Boys, and we are looking at what is going on with young boys. And it's interesting, I'm in my mid-40s. My generation did pretty well, frankly. When we look at 25 and below, it's going really, really badly.
It's shockingly bad.
And so we talk about the Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate is a symptom of what is going on in that group. It's not the cause. And so actually having a sort of moment in a young boy's life that says, okay, this is what a positive vision looks like. And it's not a zero-sum game of men versus women. It's actually half boys do not grow up with their dads anymore. What does positive masculinity look like? What does it look like to be a contributor to society? And so that is fatherhood.
And if society gets that wrong, I mean, the issue, the metrics on boys, the data on it, particularly regionally, in some places, it's absolutely horrific. Educational attainment, collapsing, literally collapsing, terrible. And it's got to be said. I think that my criticism of some of the people that would criticize us for bringing it up, almost. I mean, people like Andrew Tate are not the solution, I think. But really, what they're doing is they've created a liberal environment which has caused all these problems, and then they're criticizing some of the symptoms.
Yeah, exactly.
Of them.
I mean, actually, historically, our gangs were. I mean, the very first paper that the CSJ did on gangs was called "Dying to Belong," and it was basically saying that these kids don't belong at home, they don't have strong roots, they don't have good attachments, and they are looking for somebody to show them a way in the world and give them a family and somewhere to belong. And I think you're seeing that now with Andrew Tate. He's the latest version of that. So like, well, maybe I can join this guy's clan because I'm not getting it at home anymore.
Yeah, but I still think we've all got to end the omerta on speaking the truth about some of this stuff, because again, I don't know what you do in the morning, but if you switch on Radio 4 and you listen to any of these things, it's like knife crime. People will talk about knife crime, and some other kids got killed, murdered. And the solutions are always trite. The usual thing is I'm absolutely fed up with hearing about youth clubs. I mean, I'm not saying they're not important, but honestly, it's not serious. You're not being serious.
Yeah.
And Lancey dads, and if you can't, you've got the data, Ed, on this.
Yeah.
There's a causal link to the pressure that someone's under, the lack of role models, calming influence, all the discipline, all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And we've got to be honest about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite the number of conversations I've been in and around this for decades now, and the same conversations that I can't say recently, it was banning zombie knives, as if that is the problem. And it's like, that is not the problem we're facing.
Honestly, on that, Ed, you'd have to ban steel.
Yes,
ultimately.
Exactly.
No, I despair of it. Well, let's hope we can fight the fight and try and, do everything we can to support the family and policy, but also I think cultural discourse. That's what we need. Yeah,
very much so.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Take care.